Good morning, everyone. Today's video is a sort of follow-up to a video I made about half a year ago. Actually, a little bit more. Might have been more like 8 months or something. So in spring, early summer of last year. And that video was one where I sort of went off on a bit of a rant regarding the sole focus of your training being aesthetics. The thumbnail of the video had the phrase bodybuilding is goofy question mark in it. And so one might be led to believe that I have a fundamental problem with bodybuilding. However, this is not really the case. Actually, it's not the case at all, to be completely honest. And I think in the heat of the moment, because I was having a lot of fun in that video, I really went off on this idea of, lifting with as little effort as possible to get as much aesthetics as possible. And in general, this intense focus on aesthetics to the point where, people are taking steroids just as regular people in their regular day-to-day life, or, women are are taking like 15 billion pictures of their ass in the mirror and shit. In my sort of ranty state, I think I didn't make clear enough that bodybuilding itself is not inherently a bad thing. Now, this might sound like a strange statement if you have seen the previous video, because I did talk about the fact that, in my opinion, training should serve a purpose, a function. Training should actually make you more competent, and that quality training that is not hyper specialized, that actually aims to make you more athletic, stronger in general, will always automatically make you more aesthetic. And that the same kind of goes for women as well. That training that aims to make them, stronger, more functional, but also, especially for women, healthier, will automatically make them more attractive. And so a lot of people have the idea that bodybuilding is this kind of show muscle thing. Bodybuilders are not actually that strong. They might still be stronger than someone who doesn't lift at all, but compared to a proper strength athlete or whatever, bodybuilders are not that strong. And of course, bodybuilders are not athletic, right? They can't move properly, they aren't agile, all of these different types of thoughts people have regarding bodybuilding. And I kind of want to get into what makes bodybuilding great in this video, because I, in fact, use a lot of bodybuilding in my personal training. And I don't train mainly for aesthetics. The aesthetics are just an automatic result of me having a very generalized training that aims to make me strong in many different capacities, also keep me, decently lean. I'm not specialized for strength like a strongman who might get super fat, right? And it doesn't matter to him because that can actually, in some instances, even be a benefit. I'm also not a long distance runner. I try to be pretty good at just about everything. And then my main focus, the thing I generally want to be best at, is fighting and maybe parkour. So something in between running, jumping, and climbing. A sort of, I think general athleticism hits these two categories very well. And I think my body very much reflects that. Despite this fact, despite the fact that I am aiming for athleticism, despite the fact that one of my big focus points, I already started doing this last year, but especially this year, is flexibility. I want to, be able to do the splits again. All of these types of things are things I look out for, I focus on. I'm doing a lot of cardio. Despite all of this, I do a lot of what could genuinely be considered classic bodybuilding training. Now, why is that if I don't care about aesthetics that much? I kind of already delved into this in my video. Let me think, what was it called? It's linked up here, in the fucking info thing. The video I made on the endurance power scale, on strength as a concept being more of a spectrum than a specific ability, a specific attribute. In that video, I talked about the fact that someone who trains powerlifting for a year is probably going to be stronger at the big three than someone who trains bodybuilding for the same amount of time. But as soon as we leave the domain of the big three, even on exercises that include muscle groups that are involved in the big three, the bodybuilder is probably going to be stronger. And overall, the bodybuilder is going to be stronger at more things than the powerlifter. And the reason behind this is that bodybuilding builds muscle, first and foremost. And muscle is always there for the purpose of lifting heavy stuff. The body creates muscle to create the potential for strength. It's just additional muscle fiber. Now, what you do on a powerlifting program, for instance, or any other type of weightlifting program that is focused on lifting the most weight on whatever lift you're doing, is you're doing a lot of conditioning of your nervous system. So you're not only building muscle, in fact, you are potentially building muscle to a much lesser extent, but you are also priming that muscle to work as effectively as possible. You want to recruit as many of those muscle fibers that are there. But as you can tell from what I'm saying here, the maximum amount of strength you're able to output potentially is limited by the ultimate limiting factor, the amount of muscle mass that is actually there. Because you can prime your nervous system to use that muscle as effectively as possible all you want. The maximum amount of muscle you're able to use is the muscle that is there. That is, obvious. The actual amount, the actual number of muscle fibers you can recruit. So someone who just has more muscle maybe isn't using it as effectively, but if this person is training in relatively low rep ranges, so if someone is doing bodybuilding style training and he is, in many cases, using rep ranges that go as low as 4 to 6, 6 to 8, something like that, relatively low, right? This guy can probably learn how to use his muscle very effectively in a pretty short amount of time, train his nervous system to output a lot of force within a very short time frame, and then at that point, he's just a guy with a lot of muscle. The difference being, of course, that is what I mentioned in that video, that a powerlifter only trains very specific muscles, and I think there's a lot of imbalances if you just train powerlifting for the purposes of being the best powerlifter. So, yeah, I was generally very critical of powerlifting, but that's actually not what we want to talk about in this video. What we want to talk about is the fact that I sort of pointed out the fact that bodybuilders are actually pretty fucking strong. And that is where we get into the value of bodybuilding. What makes bodybuilding great, ironically, is the fact that it is focused on aesthetics. Now, this might be confusing to someone hearing this and thinking, I thought this guy was all about functionality. I thought this guy was all about, training in a way that makes you better at stuff, not a way that is focused on being the most aesthetic. I am. But interestingly enough, the human body is pretty ingenious in these types of ways. What people generally find very aesthetically pleasing in humans, and I'm not talking about people who are deep into weird fucking gym culture. I'm talking about most people out there. Most people don't find a Ronnie Coleman or something attractive. Let's get that out of the way right away. And everything I'm going to be talking about in this video mainly applies to people who are not on steroids. I've, made a video recently on steroids where I think I was pretty clear about my stance. I have a huge issue with steroids. I think the advice people who are on steroids give regarding most things, really, but especially training, is to be treated with a huge grain of salt, because you're talking to someone who has chosen to take hard drugs and fuck up their health to look big, and honestly not even that aesthetic, because most people will find the way he looks very gross. So everything this person says, any and all types of advice this person might give should be treated very cautiously, right? Where was I? Right. So this video mainly is, or essentially exclusively, talks about people who bodybuild naturally, who use the methods of bodybuilding, the exercises bodybuilding uses, the type of training generally, but they do so in a completely natural way. If you bodybuild naturally, generally speaking, it is very, very difficult to put on an amount of muscle that people would genuinely be bothered by visually. I dare say it is virtually impossible. So everything we are talking about here does fall into the realm of general aesthetics, not aesthetics in the eyes of someone who's already 100 kilos and who looks at another guy who's 140 kilos and goes like, oh damn, that guy looks so good. And in reality, the guy he's talking about looks like he is next in line to play the Incredible Hulk with no CGI. No, that guy is not aesthetic. Sorry to break it to you, but the general populace finds him gross. But anyone who is building muscle naturally, even if they have a very, very impressive natural physique, is generally going to be in aesthetic territory for the average person, for the general populace. Now, what is interesting here is that there seems to be a very deep connection between form and function and also visual beauty. So something, the form of which is functional, is very, very functional, is very well adapted to its function, in many cases will have this sort of innate appeal, this innate attractiveness, this innate beauty. If you think of cats, I think cats are a great example of this. Cats, in my opinion, are one of nature's most impressive, greatest creations. And I'm not just talking about house cats here or big cats. I'm not talking just about lions and tigers. I'm also not talking about, Jerry, the neighborhood tomcat. I'm talking about any and all cats, really. They have different looks. You know, you got like a snow leopard, you got a lion, you got a wildcat. They have different styles, right? There are different cat editions, if you will, and they have varying looks depending on how exactly they hunt. But all cats have one thing in common. They are incredibly fucking effective at what they do. They are the cream of the crop when it comes to land predators. Cats are like the ultimate fighter build. You know, a bear is tough, is a big guy. He's strong, he's tanky. But I think most people would agree that a bear is more akin to like a tank, you know, like a tanky guy, a big, tough guy. And some people like that. I'm a lot more fascinated, though, by cats. Because even very big cats, even a tiger, even a lion, is still relatively agile, relatively fast. They can jump like crazy. If you've ever seen a snow leopard jump like big distance, you look at that shit and you're like, what is this? Is he using the fucking force jump from Star Wars? So cats are fast. Cats have insane reflexes. Cats are absolute masters at hunting. They jump crazy high and crazy far and, you know, all of these different types of things. They are like the super soldiers of nature, the Captain America of nature. Or actually, probably more like the Winter Soldier of nature. And what do cats generally have in common? They look really, really good. They look incredible. They look amazing. Whether we're talking about a majestic lion or tiger, whether we're talking about a lynx, believe they're called in English, you know, they have a cool look. They look sick. They look different from a lion or a tiger, but they are still a very beautiful creature. Even house cats. I mean, depending on the breed, humans have this tendency with fucking, what are they called? French bulldogs? Like these tiny, degenerate little fuckers. Humans have this tendency to breed impressive, majestic things into submission to the point where they look very, very gross. But generally speaking, you know, relatively normal house cat breeds, just a regular type of cat, they are kind of beautiful, man. Really, an impressive animal, visually, and again, in terms of its ability to do what it does in nature. Kill at the end of the day. Hunt. Take down prey. And I think this goes for a lot of animals that are very, very good at what they do, that are at the top of their respective food chain. They have this innate sort of impressive look. Are you serious? Someone is fucking... Where am I going with this? Why is this guy sitting here talking about cats all of a sudden? I thought this video was about bodybuilding, you might think. Well, in the context of general aesthetics, again, no steroids, no weird space marine shit. We are talking about normal people being attracted, being visually fascinated by normal things. In this context, bodybuilding has this same type of connection. How so, you might ask? Well, for a body to generally be as aesthetic as possible, it should have a large amount of muscle. And again, all of the things I'm talking about here only apply to naturals. If you are thinking of an IFBB Pro, when I say large amounts of muscle, that is not what we're talking about. We are talking about significant amounts of muscle, close to as much muscle as someone can pack on as a natural, okay? Without getting super fat. Because that's the next thing. Not only do you need large amounts of muscle, you also need to be relatively lean. You can't be super fat. There's a range here. Some women are cool with a slightly greater amount of body fat if a guy's very, very big. Like if you're a hulking, imposing figure, you might be kind of more of that bear build that I just talked about. Less of a cat, more of a bear. You know, you're a little bit chunkier. You're maybe not as agile, not as fast, but you're tanky. You're strong. You can still move, generally speaking, because you don't have unnatural amounts of muscle. You're still a natural guy, but you're more on the strong, big side. Some women prefer relatively light. Not a ton of muscle, still significant amounts of muscle. Still substantial muscleage, if you will. But yeah, not a ton of muscle, and they are more focused on you being relatively lean. Some women prefer that. I would say the general populace, this doesn't just go for women, by the way, men as well, generally speaking, prefer something in the middle. So a lot of muscle, but also relatively lean, although you don't have to be crazy lean. So probably still above 10% body fat, you know, a natural range of body fat, an amount of body fat that you can actually naturally sit at. So maybe 10 to 15%, and close to as much muscle as you can walk around with at that weight. And interestingly enough, as someone who does train for functionality, as someone who does aim to be good at actual physical endeavors and who trains in various different ways, I would actually say that this is generally the best physique for that, the best form for this type of function. Now, can you have more endurance by cutting down on your muscle? Sure. If you are pretty big, if you have a pretty significant amount of muscle on your frame, losing some of that would give you better endurance. But can you still have very, very impressive stamina? Not by the standards of a marathon runner, maybe, but in general, compared to the average person or even the average athletic person. Can you have that and also be pretty big in terms of just muscle mass, not being super fat, but having a significant amount of muscle? Yes, absolutely. You can have very good stamina and carry a lot of muscle on your frame. The difference between you and the marathon runner being that the marathon runner maybe has min-maxed for endurance more, but you could fucking snap him in half. And if you look at fighting, which I would say is one of the core physical activities that you can use to quantify athleticism, you don't need the endurance of a marathon runner. Someone who does that professionally, or at least takes it very, very seriously, that type of thing. You don't need that. What you need is a sufficient amount of stamina to not gas out before you can kill your opponent in a life or death fight, or defeat him in a match or whatever. And that is usually a substantial amount of stamina, but not an amount of stamina that is unattainable with a large amount of muscle on your body. Now, the reason I talked about parkour earlier, and just to be clear, I am talking about the functional aspect of parkour, traversing the terrain in a way that is quick, that is functional, that is energy efficient, if you will. I'm not talking about flips and all of those types of things which look cool, sure, but have no purpose really. The reason I mentioned parkour is because I think this is a good supplementary core athletic capacity to focus on next to fighting. Because fighting mainly takes place on the ground. And so the relationship between your weight and your actual strength is not as relevant as it is with something like parkour, where you got a little bit of climbing, you got running, you got jumping, all of these things. I think practicing parkour and fighting is the thing that physically gets you closest to being the cat, if you will. So being strong, being very impressively strong and explosive and powerful, but also strong in relation to your weight. You can still jump high, you can run fast, those types of things, which, someone who is very, very big, very chunky, might still be able, if he gets like a running start, to pick up a decent amount of speed, but he's not going to be able to jump very far or very high. He's going to have a very tough time traversing terrain, climbing up things, jumping over things. All of these types of things are going to be very, very hard. So fighting has you focused on, yes, indeed, getting pretty big, because at the end of the day, being muscular in fighting is a huge advantage over people, and I'll get to that in a minute. But parkour forces you to stay light on your feet. And those two things together, in my opinion, form a sort of perfect middle of what athleticism is all about. However, if you just fight and do parkour, you are not going to become very big. You are going to build muscle, definitely, but not as much muscle as you could be building. And this is where we get back to bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is, without a shadow of a doubt, the best way to build baseline muscle. And to do so in a relatively holistic way without practicing something like, wrestling. I talked about this in my video on fighting, which is also going to be somewhere up here. Wrestling, grappling, those types of things are great for building muscle, especially in your back, in a very, very holistic way, where you're hitting tiny muscles, you're hitting every muscle from various different angles. So you're building muscle in a totally different way to weight training. But beyond specialized training in a sport, bodybuilding is pretty much the ultimate way of building muscle in a fairly balanced fashion all across your body. So muscle that is sort of devoid of any specific function applied to it, it just increases your baseline muscle mass. And this baseline muscle mass just increases your baseline strength potential across your entire body, head to toe, if you're bodybuilding properly. And the muscle you build can then be molded into whatever you need. So in a fighting context, if you're a natural bodybuilder and you start fighting, as soon as you learn some skills, you are going to have a huge advantage over other people because you're way stronger. Again, we're only talking about naturals here. We're talking about natural amounts of muscle, naturally attainable amounts of muscle. There's a reason why there are weight classes in any type of fighting sport. Now, in some ways, I'm not a huge fan of weight classes, and I'll probably talk about that in a future video. But, yeah, the reason weight classes generally exist is for safety reasons, and that tells you all you really need to know. People don't want fighters who are relatively light fighting heavy guys. Why? Because 9 times out of 10, they would get fucked up. And that is irrespective of whether or not they are more skilled than the heavy fighter. If you got a lightweight, if you got a fucking featherweight, or whatever the fuck, fighting a heavyweight fighter, and it doesn't even have to be a really impressive heavyweight fighter. He doesn't even have to be crazy skilled. Just, he's also a fighter. You know, he can strike a little bit, he can wrestle a little bit. Generally speaking, he would kill the smaller guy, or, you know, beat the living shit out of him. This illusion that size doesn't matter, strength doesn't matter, which I think most people who can actually fight don't have. But a lot of people who sort of get into self-defense or martial arts with this idea of skill beats size, you know, if I do this and this and this, I can actually beat this guy up. If you're a 50-kilo woman, I dare say you would have to be on an otherworldly level of skill to beat me in a fight. And I am not a crazy martial artist. I'm not a super impressive fighter. I have a martial arts background. I know how to wrestle. I know how to grapple. I know how to strike a little bit. Wrestling is probably my strongest category, or judo mainly. But if you're 50 kilos, what are you going to do to me? Because it's not like I'm completely unskilled and you can surprise jump me and put me in chokehold and sleep me before I can use my strength in any capacity. That's not going to happen. So even if you're way more skilled than me, I'm just about skilled enough to not get taken out by some, you know, fluke, by some crazy surprise attack. And at that point, you're pretty much fucked. And now imagine a guy who's 20 kilos heavier than me. What are you going to do fighting him? Nothing, really. So, bodybuilding is a huge advantage when it comes to fighting. And I noticed this when I picked up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because right out the gate, I was one of the heaviest and certainly one of the strongest guys there. And there were guys with better stamina. But other than that, just physically, I was essentially superior to almost every person I would roll with. I had this one opponent who would always go full force on me, probably because I was significantly stronger, significantly bigger. And I didn't even have to try that hard. I would focus on, you know, trying to use different techniques, maybe try this out, maybe try that out, you know. For my opponent, it was a serious role. Actually, you know, going hard, trying their hardest to submit me. Has yet to happen, by the way. I don't know how heavy this person is, probably maybe 20 kilos lighter than me. Maybe that could actually, yeah, right about 20 kilos lighter. I don't break a sweat rolling with this individual. And again, my opponent is going hard, is really trying to submit me. Full strength, full force, not going into techniques, into their submission attempts very slowly or very softly either. If someone who was actually my size did that, I would think, you know, relax. You're going a little bit hard here. But nothing ever happens. And I just want to be clear, this is not me being cocky or trying to show off. I've also had people there who I've rolled against who were significantly heavier than me. And In many cases, I did manage to submit them once or twice, but at the end of those rolls, I was incredibly gassed because just the amount of strength, the amount of energy that was involved in moving these heavy people, in taking them down, in moving them around on the ground. Even when you're using technique, if someone that size is just full force resisting a technique, if you're technically better, or if you're doing something the correct way, quote unquote, you might still manage to get into a superior position or get a submission in. But it's just way harder. It requires an incredible amount of energy that I just don't have to use when I roll against people who are more my size or smaller even. So yeah, size makes a huge difference, and especially if that size is tied directly to strength. So if you're not fat, if you're not chubby, if you're literally just bigger in terms of having a ton of muscle mass, that's a crazy difference. And again, bodybuilding is the training method to train as many different muscles, really focus on smaller muscles that might get neglected a little bit with more general, like barbell compound movement training that doesn't have any isolation, any of that stuff in there. Bodybuilding is really the best way to acquire as much general muscle as possible that you can then mold into what you want it to be. I mean, what training methodology uses specific exercises for the rear delts or the side delts? What training methodology focuses on different parts of the triceps or biceps? No one does that. And you might say, well, is that really relevant? Does it matter? Yes, it matters, because depending on how you are fighting an opponent, depending on what specific position you are in as you strike and wrestle and grapple, very specific parts of those muscles are going to be important. And someone who does a few general barbell exercises or something like that is always going to be weaker when it comes to specific movements than someone who trains as many specific muscles as they can individually. I guess what I'm trying to say, to kind of wrap this up, bring all of this to a close a little bit, is that the fact that bodybuilding focuses on aesthetics and focuses thus ultimately on a body that is very, very balanced, because that actually looks the best, I would argue, in most people's opinion. Because of this fact, it actually, ironically, becomes the ultimate tool for building muscle that you can then use for function. Bodybuilding, when done naturally, can be an incredible tool in your toolkit to acquire function. However, your mentality should always be that function is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to look good. The ultimate goal is to use the visual appeal, to use the visual feedback you get from looking in the mirror, from evaluating your physique on whether or not it's symmetric, whether or not there are imbalances, certain muscles aren't big enough. Using all of that to reach a higher function, that should be the goal, not the visuals itself. But if you reach for the visuals, generally speaking, you will acquire that higher function. Now, of course, something you cannot see is stamina. Stamina is something that that is not visually represented in a physique necessarily. Of course, someone who is very big and chonky, kind of chubby as well, is generally going to have worse stamina. But if that person has done a lot of endurance training, they are not going to have worse stamina. So visual appeal can, to an extent, also be an indicator of stamina, but beyond this sort of surface level of, yes, size generally makes you heavier, which means you require more energy to move your body, and that is going to influence your stamina. Beyond that sort of surface level relationship, stamina needs to be trained regardless of what you look like. And that is where bodybuilding kind of falls flat in many ways, right? Because you can have a fairly aesthetic physique and also have, let's say, not great stamina. Stamina certainly improves your work capacity to build more muscle, but you don't have to be particularly competent in the field of endurance, in the world of endurance, to build a relatively impressive aesthetic physique. So you also need to see these limitations that bodybuilding as a tool has when it comes to creating function, or improving, rather, your function. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I hope I have made my stance here clear. Bodybuilding is an incredible tool. You have lots of very specific exercises for targeting very specific muscles individually that otherwise might not be hit in this kind of way if you just, trained with the big three or some bullshit like that, or maybe do a few pull-ups even in addition to those. You're still not going to get to the same level of strength potential that you might get to if you train bodybuilding style, at least to an extent. But at the same time, as any tool does, it has its limitations. Those limitations should be seen, should be considered. And at the end of the day, training to just look good, if you're not actually utilizing the strength potential you build, that's just cringe. That's some fucking princess shit. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed yourselves, if you found this interesting, helpful, if you learned something, if this video provided you with some kind of value, go ahead and leave a like. You can also go ahead and leave a comment if you have any questions about this video, any suggestions for future videos, anything you would like to learn about, you would like me to make a video about. If you want to discuss something I mentioned in this video, you can go ahead and leave a comment, or you can also check out my Instagram, which is, as always, down below in the description, and you can hit me up there if you have a more detailed question, if you want to discuss something, if you have a suggestion for a future video, you can do that there as well. And if you want to follow me on my journey, if you want to join me on my journey of growing this channel, making more of these videos, I talk about philosophy, about fitness and general health. Really, those three topics include a lot of different things, and I generally make videos on just about anything I want, but those are my sort of focal points. So if those are topics you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe and activate the notification bell if you want notifications. For some reason, my voice is fucking leaving me. I don't know why. It's early in the morning, actually. Maybe last week was a little bit hardcore on the old vocal cords. Anyways, doesn't fucking matter. I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, have a good one.